When you ask the average horror fan about Stephen King and vampires, their mind almost instantly goes to one specific place: Jerusalem's Lot, 1975. They picture Kurt Barlow chilling in a dark basement, Ben Mears wielding a makeshift wooden cross, and a small Maine town getting slowly swallowed by the traditional Bram Stoker-style undead. For decades, the mainstream consensus has been that Salem's Lot was King's definitive singular statement on the vampire mythos. He did it, he nailed it, and then he moved on to killer cars, psychic hotels, and cosmic clowns. But that consensus is completely wrong. If you map out King's entire literary multiverse, what his dedicated readers call the macroverse, you quickly realize that King never actually stopped writing about vampires. He just stopped calling them Dracula. Over a 50-year career, King quietly constructed one of the most complex, terrifying, and bizarre vampire ecologies in modern fiction. He evolved them from traditional caped bloodsuckers into dimension-hopping corporate executives, pilot license-holding serial killers, emotional parasites that feed on dying children, and shape-shifting entities that live on pure human grief. To truly understand this evolution, we have to look past the boundaries of that one famous town. We have to look at how King integrated these monsters into his grand cosmic design. King realized early on that the classic vampire mythos was too restrictive for the sprawling American landscape he wanted to map out. A vampire tied to a coffin and a native soil couldn't survive the interstate highway system, the rise of modern mass media, or the cosmic realities of the Dark Tower. So he broke the mold. He scattered different species of bloodsuckers across his bibliography, hiding them in short story collections, fantasy epics, and modern crime thrillers. Today we are locking the gates of Jerusalem's Lot in our rear-view mirror. We are going out into the dark highways of the King multiverse to track down the hidden, the forgotten, and the terrifyingly reimagined vampires that rule his broader mythos. Our first stop takes us to the immediate aftermath of King's first vampire outbreak. Published in his 1978 collection Night Shift, the short story, One for the Road, serves as the true harrowing epilogue to Salem's Lot. The story takes place a few years after the town burned down, but the surrounding woods and abandoned roads remain deeply infected. The narrative is framed as a recollection by an old-timer named Booth. It's the dead of winter in Maine during a brutal blizzard that has cut off power and trapped everyone indoors. Booth and his lifelong friend, a bar owner named Tukey, are sitting in a local tavern a few miles outside the ruins of Jerusalem's Lot, listening to the wind howl. The peace is shattered when a freezing, panicked out-of-stater named Gerard Lumley burst through the door. Lumley's car stalled out in a massive snowdrift on a secondary road, a road that runs right through the boundary of the dead town. In his desperation, Lumley left his wife, Janie, and his young daughter, Francie, in the vehicle to go find help, thinking he was just in a normal Maine blizzard. Now Booth and Tukey know what anyone living near Cumberland County knows. You don't go near the lot after dark, and you especially don't go near it during a storm when the monsters are hungry and shielded by the whiteout conditions. Despite the sheer terror of the situation, the two old men can't let a woman and a child freeze to death. They fire up Tukey's old scout truck and drive out into the blinding snow, bringing Lumley along. What follows is a slow, agonizing buildup of atmospheric dread. As they cross the town lines, the truck's headlights cut through the snow, revealing the skeletal remains of the burned-out town. When they finally locate Lumley's buried car, they find it completely empty. The doors are hanging open and the interior is freezing. And then, out in the swirling white darkness, the nightmare begins. Lumley's wife, Janie, appears, but she hasn't frozen to death. She has already been turned. King doesn't have her attack with wild animal rage. Instead, she uses the terrifyingly intimate leverage of a spouse. She stands in the snow, looking beautiful and deathly pale, calling out to her husband in a sweet, clear voice that cuts right through the howling wind, begging him to come to her. Lumley, completely mesmerized and unable to process the supernatural horror, breaks away from the old men and runs into her arms. The moment he gets close, her mouth opens to reveal a maw of predatory fangs, and she clamps onto his throat, dragging him into the dark. But the true horror of the story hits a moment later. The little girl, Francie, steps out of the shadows of the tree line. She is turned into a tiny pale predator with glowing, hypnotic yellow eyes. She doesn't look like a victim. She looks like a seasoned hunter. She offers a sickeningly sweet twist on the classic vampire's invitation, holding out her arms to Booth and asking her surviving protector for a kiss. The hypnotic power of the child vampire is almost too much for Booth to fight off. He begins to step forward, entirely captivated by her gaze, when Tukey manages to snap him out of it by flashing a heavy light and dragging him back to the truck. They barely escape with their lives, leaving the Lumley family to the dark. Interestingly, while One for the Road never received a major Hollywood feature film adaptation, it has become a legendary staple in King's Dollar Baby program, a system where King allows student filmmakers to adapt his short stories for a single dollar. It was also adapted as a highly atmospheric episode of the modern audio drama series Stephen King's Night Shift. The story is crucial because it establishes a thesis that guides the rest of King's vampire fiction. The most terrifying thing about a vampire isn't its physical strength or its fangs. It's the fact that it looks at your deepest, most sacred human attachments, the love for a child, the loyalty to a partner, and uses them as a hunting lure. As King moved into the late 80s and early 90s, he began to look at the vampire mythos through a different lens: modern trash culture, low-budget aviation, and tabloid journalism. This transition brings us to a pair of tightly linked short stories that present one of King's most terrifying and unique standalone creatures. Let's look first at the Night Flier, published in the 1993 anthology Nightmares and Dreamscapes. The protagonist of this story isn't a hero, a priest, or a traditional hunter. It's Richard Dees, a cynical, morally bankrupt reporter for a sleazy, sensationalist tabloid called The Inside View. Dees is a character King fans might recognize from a brief mention in The Dead Zone. He's a man who makes his living exploiting human misery and fabricating sensational headlines. Dees is assigned to chase down a bizarre serial killer who flies a black Cessna Skymaster airplane across small, isolated airfields along the East Coast. At each stop, the killer leaves behind a trail of brutally drained bodies, always paying for his aviation fuel with cash and signing the logs with the name Dwight Renfield, a clear, arrogant nod to Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dees treats the case as a golden ticket to a front-page layout. He rents his own plane and retraces the flight paths, interviewing terrified airport line mechanics and small-town witnesses. As he uncovers the trail, he realizes that this killer is doing something impossible, flying exclusively at night, landing without lights, and leaving behind pools of blood that refuse to coagulate. Yet Dees' absolute cynicism prevents him from believing in the supernatural until it is far too late. He finally tracks the Night Flier to a remote, storm-drenched airport terminal in Wilmington, Maryland. Dees lands his plane in the middle of a torrential downpour and walks into a completely dark, silent terminal building. The power is out and the air smells heavily of copper and open guts. As he explores the building with his camera flashlight, he discovers a bloodbath. Everyone on the night shift has been slaughtered, their bodies drained of fluid. Dees retreats to the terminal bathroom to throw up, and that is where he finally catches his scoop. The stall door opens and Dwight Renfield steps out. King's description of the creature here is a masterpiece of body horror. This isn't a charming aristocrat, this is a massive bat-faced abomination with leathery skin, huge ears, and a mouth filled with a circular row of needle-sharp teeth. It wears a dark flying cloak that looks like a stylized cape. But the most horrifying element is how the monster interacts with reality. As Dees watches in sheer terror, the creature stands before the bathroom mirror to straighten its clothes. The mirror does not reflect the vampire's body. Instead, the glass shows a reflection of the room with the dead bodies of the terminal workers standing up, staring at Dees. The vampire turns to Dees, acknowledging his pursuit, and reveals that he has been watching the reporter chase him. Instead of killing Dees, the Night Flier decides to break him. He slices his own wrist and forces Dees to drink his black, parasitic blood from a filth-crusted toilet bowl, filling the reporter's mind with cosmic hallucinations of the infinite dark. The creature then walks out to his Cessna and takes off into the thunderstorm. When the police arrive minutes later, they find a maddened, blood-drenched Richard Dees hacking at the dead bodies with an axe in a state of complete psychological collapse. They arrest him for the murders, leaving the real monster to fly free. In 1997, The Night Flier was adapted into a feature film starring the brilliant Miguel Ferrer as Richard Dees. Directed by Mark Pavia, the movie is widely considered by King enthusiasts to be one of the most underrated and exceptionally faithful King adaptations ever made. Ferrer perfectly captures the bitter, unlikable nature of Dees, and the film's makeup effects for the vampire's true face are genuinely nightmarish. But King wasn't finished with this specific breed of aviation-loving monster. In that very same 1993 anthology, he published a shorter, fast-paced story called Popsy, which acts as a spiritual companion piece to the Night Flier. On the surface, Popsy seems like a completely unrelated tale about a human monster. The protagonist is a low-life named Sheridan, a man drowning in massive gambling debts to a ruthless loan shark named Mr. Wizard. To save his own skin, Sheridan has turned to the most despicable trade imaginable, kidnapping young children from shopping malls and delivering them to a shadowy human trafficking ring. Sheridan is hunting for a target at a local mall when he spots a strange, pale little boy standing by an exit, crying because he has lost his Popsy. Sheridan swoops in, using standard predator tactics, promising the boy that he knows exactly where his grandfather is. He hustles the kid into his modified van and hits the highway. As they drive down the isolated secondary roads of Maine, Sheridan notices that the boy isn't acting like a normal kidnap victim. He isn't crying anymore. He is eerily calm. The boy turns his pale face to Sheridan and displays an unnatural physical strength, easily denting the van's dashboard with his small fist. He looks at Sheridan with strange, dark eyes and says, completely matter-of-factly, that his Popsy is very angry, that his Popsy can smell his scent, and that his Popsy is tracking the van right now. Sheridan tries to brush it off as a child's imaginary defense mechanism, but the atmosphere inside the van grows incredibly cold. Suddenly, the van's engine begins to sputter, and the headlights dim. Sheridan looks up through the windshield and sees a massive dark shape dropping out of the night sky. At 70 miles an hour, something heavy slams onto the roof of the vehicle. With a horrific screech of tearing metal, the entire steel roof of the van is sheared open as if it were a tin can. A massive winged humanoid figure drops into the passenger seat. It is Popsy. King describes him as an older, incredibly ancient version of the exact same bat-faced creature featured in the Night Flier. He has the same leathery wings, the same ancient smell of the earth, and the same terrifying circular rows of fangs. Popsy doesn't say a word to Sheridan. He simply reaches across the seat, grabs the kidnapper by the hair, and rips his throat open with his bare claws. As Sheridan lies dying on the floorboards of the crashing van, Popsy gently cradles his young grandson, lifting the boy up so he can lean over Sheridan's neck and drink his very first fill of warm human blood. King heavily implied in his author notes and literary discussions that Popsy and the Night Flier are part of the exact same ancient, evolutionary offshoot of the vampire species operating silently in the rural pockets of America. They represent a primal, predatory strain that has learned to utilize modern conveniences, vans, malls, airplanes, to feed their ancient hunger without ever drawing the attention of mainstream society. This brings us to the grand connective tissue of King's entire universe, the Dark Tower series. If you want to understand the true structural reality of vampires in Stephen King's fiction, you have to look at how he codifies them within his magnum opus. The Dark Tower isn't just a fantasy story, it's the linchpin that connects every single book King has ever written. And in the 5th and 6th volumes of the series, Wolves of the Calla and Song of Susanna, King does something extraordinary. He brings back Father Donald Callahan, the tragic alcoholic priest from Salem's Lot. When we last saw Callahan in 1975, his faith had failed him during a confrontation with the vampire master Kurt Barlow. Barlow smashed Callahan's cross, forced the priest to drink his corrupted vampire blood, and left him alive but fundamentally altered. Because he was contaminated with vampire blood, Callahan could no longer enter his own church. The holy water boiled at his touch, and the sacred symbols scorched his skin. He fled New York City, becoming a drifting alcoholic on the literal margins of society. Through Callahan's narrative journey across different dimensions and realities, King pulls back the curtain on his entire universe and establishes an official, cosmic taxonomy for the vampire species. He explains that vampires are not a single uniform type of monster. Instead, they are divided into 3 distinct classes, each with its own origins, biological traits, and roles within the cosmic order. The first class, known as Type 1 vampires, are often referred to in the lore as the Grandfathers. These creatures are completely immortal, exceptionally rare, and ancient beyond human comprehension. They were not created by a bite, instead, they crawled out of the Prim, the chaotic, primordial, magical soup that existed before the universe was formed and the beams of the Dark Tower were set in place. Type 1 vampires are completely non-human demons that merely wear a shifting human glamour to hide their true, rotting, insectoid, or bat-like countenances. Kurt Barlow was a Type 1 grandfather, as was Popsy and the Night Flier. They possess immense psychic abilities, can control weather, command lower animals, and are completely immune to standard human weapons. They are the intellectual masters of the vampire underworld. Below them are the Type 2 vampires, which King refers to as the Thralls. These are the traditional vampires that most horror fans are familiar with. They are created when a Type 1 or an older Type 2 completely drains a human being and infects them with their venom. Type 2 vampires have a lifespan that can stretch for centuries, but they are not truly immortal. They are aggressively predatory, possess distinct yellow eyes, cannot handle direct sunlight under any circumstances, and are bound by traditional weaknesses like wooden stakes, fire, and holy symbols. They are the soldiers and the footmen used to overrun towns, exactly like what happened to Jerusalem's Lot. Finally, King introduces the Type 3 vampires, which he calls the mosquitoes. These are the most insidious, numerous, and modern vampires in the entire taxonomy. Type 3 vampires have a normal, human-length lifespan and are created through casual, non-lethal contact, minor bites, or fluid exchange with higher-tier vampires. Unlike their older cousins, Type 3 vampires can walk freely in the daylight. They eat normal human food, they can hold down standard jobs, and they pass completely unnoticed through human society. They do not have fangs, and they do not turn their victims into monsters. Instead, they operate as stealthy parasites, using a razor-sharp needle-like appendage hidden under their tongues to drink tiny amounts of human blood, while their victims sleep or are incapacitated. Crucially, King reveals that Type 3 vampires are responsible for the spread of terrible blood-borne illnesses throughout human history, including the HIV epidemic of the late 20th century. They are cosmic ticks, feeding on humanity while hiding behind the mundane mask of everyday citizens. In Song of Susanna and the final volume, The Dark Tower 7, King takes us directly into the heart of this vampire civilization by introducing a location called the Dixie Pig. This is a high-end, highly exclusive, and deeply sinister restaurant located in New York City. On the outside, it appears to be a private club for the city's elite, but in reality, it serves as the terrestrial headquarters for the Crimson King, the ultimate cosmic antagonist of King's universe who wants to destroy the Dark Tower and plunge reality back into the chaos of the Prim. When Father Callahan, along with the gunslinger Roland Deschain and his cosmic quartet, invade the Dixie Pig, King delivers a sequence of pure, unadulterated cosmic horror. The restaurant is revealed to be a cross-dimensional crossroads where the boundaries between worlds are completely worn thin. The air inside smells of roasting, unrecognizable meat, which the text confirms is human flesh harvested from across different dimensions. Sitting at the tables, drinking and dining together, are the various factions of the Crimson King's army. Type 3. Mosquitoes sit side by side with the Cantoi, or low men, who are rat-like humanoids wearing poorly fitting plastic human masks, and in the dark VIP booths at the back sit the surviving Type 1 grandfathers. King describes these ancient masters as looking like walking corpses, their skin hanging off their bones like rotting parchment, their breath smelling of old graves and their eyes burning with a cold, ancient malice. They aren't just hiding in rural cellars anymore. They are part of a massive, bureaucratic, multi-dimensional syndicate that utilizes corporate power and magical portals to harvest human beings like cattle while actively working to tear down the infrastructure of reality. Father Callahan's final stand in the Dixie Pig is one of the most powerful character arcs in King's bibliography. Facing down an army of Type 1 and Type 2 vampires, Callahan recovers his lost faith. He realizes that his purpose wasn't to defeat the monsters in 1975, but to hold the line here, at the gates of the tower. He draws a magnificent glowing cross that lights up the dark restaurant, forcing the ancient grandfathers to recoil in agony before sacrificing his own life to buy time for his friends to escape. Before we leave the lore of the Dark Tower behind, we must examine a masterpiece of dark fantasy fiction that expands on the Type 1 vampires, the 1998 novella The Little Sisters of Illyria, which was later included in the collection Everything's Eventual. This story is a prequel to the main series, taking place when the gunslinger Roland Deschain is still a young man, wandering through a desolated, dreamlike western landscape in search of the Dark Man. Roland arrives at a small, completely abandoned desert town called Illyria. The streets are silent, save for the eerie sound of tiny silver bells tinkling in the wind. While exploring the ruins, Roland is ambushed and brutally beaten by a pack of green muties, grotesque irradiated scavengers that haunt the borders of the world. Roland loses consciousness and wakes up inside a massive, pristine white hospital tent that has been pitched on the outskirts of the dead town. He finds himself paralyzed, unable to move his arms or legs due to his severe injuries. The hospital is run by a group of pale, exceptionally beautiful women who call themselves the Little Sisters of Illyria. They wear immaculate, old-fashioned nurse uniforms and white wimples, and they speak in soft, soothing voices. They tend to Roland and a few other wounded travelers with incredible care, using a jar of strange, glowing, microscopic insects that they call the singing bugs. When placed on a wound, these bugs sing a beautiful, harmonious melody that dulls all pain and rapidly knits broken flesh and bone back together. At first, it seems like Roland has stumbled into a miraculous sanctuary. But as the days pass and his strength slowly returns, he begins to notice deeply unsettling details. The sisters never eat food. They never enter the bright desert sunlight outside the tent. And the silver bells they wear around their necks don't just ring randomly. They seem to have a hypnotic, pacifying effect on the patients, keeping them in a dreamlike, compliant state. The true, horrifying nature of the sanctuary is revealed to Roland late one night when the hypnotic effects of the bells wear off early. Through the dim shadows of the hospital tent, he watches the sisters approach the cot of the patient lying next to him, a sturdy young man who had been making a full recovery. The sisters remove their wimples and their beautiful human glamis completely drop away. Underneath, they are type 1 grandfathers, or in this case, grandmothers. Their skin is a sickly, translucent white, and their mouths open up into massive, circular, unhinged structural maws lined with rows of razor-sharp, backward-facing teeth, looking exactly like the mouths of giant leeches. They lean over the helpless patient and begin to feed, not by biting his neck, but by clamping their entire faces onto his body, slowly and methodically vacuuming the blood and vital fluids out of his flesh, while he lies there, fully conscious but completely paralyzed by their magic. Roland realizes with absolute dread that the Little Sisters of Illyria are not running a hospital. They are running a literal human feedlot. They use their singing bugs to rapidly heal wounded travelers solely because healthy, pure blood tastes sweeter and lasts longer. They fatten up their patients like livestock, nursing them to peak health before systematically draining them to the bone. What follows is a tense, claustrophobic psychological battle. Roland is trapped in his cot, knowing that as soon as his wounds are fully healed by the bugs, he is next on the menu. He finds an unlikely ally in Sister Jenna, the youngest and newest member of the Coven, who has not yet completely lost her human empathy to the demonic hunger. Jenna reveals to Roland that they are ancient creatures who have wandered the changing worlds for centuries, following wars and plagues to feed on the displaced survivors. With Jenna's help, Roland manages to smuggle his guns back into his possession. He discovers that while traditional weapons can't easily kill these ancient Type 1 entities, they are deeply vulnerable to ancient symbols of royal bloodlines. Roland possesses a silver medallion bearing the sigil of Arthur Eld, the ancient king of his world. When the head sister, Sister Mary, attempts to feed on Roland, he presses the silver medallion against her flesh. The symbol of ancient, unbroken human authority burns through her glamour like acid, causing her to erupt into a mass of writhing, insectoid filth. Roland and Jenna manage to escape the tent into the desert night, but the story ends on a deeply tragic note. The next morning, as the harsh, unfiltered desert sun rises over the dunes, Sister Jenna, who had tried to cling to her remaining humanity, cannot survive the transition into the modern world. She dissolves into a cloud of beautiful glowing light and a handful of those tiny silver bells, leaving Roland to continue his lonely quest to the tower completely alone. By the 21st century, Stephen King's conceptualization of the vampire underwent its most radical, brilliant, and modern transformation. He came to a profound realization as a horror writer. A monster does not need to drink red physical blood to be classified as a vampire. In the modern world, the most dangerous predators are the ones who steal your life force, your mental energy, and your psychological vitality. This brilliant modernization brings us directly to Dr. Sleep, the 2013 sequel to The Shining. The narrative follows an adult Dan Torrance, who is still deeply traumatized by the supernatural horrors he witnessed at the Overlook Hotel as a child. Dan has spent his adult life struggling with severe alcoholism, using the numbing effects of drink to suppress his powerful psychic abilities. The Shining. The main antagonists of Dr. Sleep are a shadowy, terrifying group of predators known across the world as the True Knot. On the surface, they are completely invisible to modern law enforcement and mainstream society because they utilize the perfect camouflage of contemporary American nomad culture. They look exactly like a collection of harmless, aging, upper-middle-class retirees wandering across the country in a massive fleet of high-end recreational vehicles. They wear floral Hawaiian shirts, they wear straw hats, they collect highway maps, and they always drive strictly under the speed limit in the slow lane. But this mundane appearance is a carefully constructed glamour. The True Knot are actually an ancient, prehistoric tribe of highly specialized psychic vampires. They do not care about physical blood, and they do not hunt in dark alleys. Instead, they feed exclusively on a highly volatile, potent psychic energy that they refer to in their own language as steam. Steam is the raw, pure essence of the Shining. It is the spiritual life force found inside unique children who possess psychic abilities. When members of the True Knot inhale this steam, it acts as a literal fountain of youth. It cures their illnesses, it reverses their physical aging, and it grants them a functional immortality that has allowed them to survive since the dawn of human civilization. But King introduces an absolutely horrific stomach-churning twist to the mechanics of this psychic consumption. The steam cannot be extracted from a child peacefully or painlessly. If a child dies quickly or quietly, the steam remains locked inside the cells of the body, becoming bitter and completely useless to the vampires. To make the steam pure, potent, and inhalable, the child must experience the absolute maximum threshold of psychological terror and agonizing, prolonged physical torture before their heart stops beating. To demonstrate the unmitigated horror of the True Knot, King writes a sequence that is widely considered to be one of the most disturbing chapters in his entire modern bibliography, the murder of Bradley Trevor, known to his family and friends as the Baseball Boy. Bradley is a happy, completely normal kid living in Iowa who happens to possess a minor, mostly unnoticed spark of the Shining. He can predict where a baseball is going to land before it is hit. The True Knot, led by their beautiful and charismatic leader, a woman known as Rose the Hat, track Bradley down and abduct him from a local park. They drive him to an isolated, abandoned clearing deep in the countryside. There, the members of the True Knot, these seemingly sweet, elderly grandmas and grandpas, gather around the child in a circle. They pull out hunting knives and systematically torture the little boy for hours, intentionally prolonging his agony to force his psychic energy to its absolute boiling point. As Bradley finally dies, he releases a massive visible cloud of glowing purple vapor from his mouth and eyes, his steam. The members of the True Knot fall upon the vapor like starving wolves, literally unhinging their jaws to inhale his final agonizing psychic screams, laughing and celebrating as the life force fills their old veins with temporary youth. King uses the True Knot to comment on a very real, deeply human type of vampire that exists in our modern world, the emotional parasites. The people who wander through families, workplaces, and relationships, systematically extracting energy, joy, innocence, and youth from the vulnerable around them, leaving nothing but empty psychological husks in their wake. In 2019, Dr. Sleep was adapted into a magnificent feature film directed by Mike Flanagan. The movie achieved something nearly impossible. It served as a faithful adaptation of King's 2013 novel, while simultaneously acting as a direct cinematic sequel to Stanley Kubrick's iconic 1980 film adaptation of The Shining, which King famously disliked. Actress Rebecca Ferguson delivers a legendary career-defining performance as Rose the Hat. She perfectly captures the terrifying duality of the character, combining a breezy, bohemian, free-spirited hippie aesthetic with the cold, calculating, and utterly merciless heart of a prehistoric apex predator. The film's depiction of the baseball boy scene, featuring a heartbreaking performance by young actor Jacob Tremblay, is so intense and structurally faithful to the book's horror that it left theater audiences completely stunned. This brings us to the final, most recent evolution of the vampire archetype in Stephen King's universe, what his dedicated fan base refers to as the outsider entities. This species is explored in meticulous detail across two closely linked works, the 2018 psychological thriller The Outsider and the title novella of his 2020 collection, If It Bleeds. These entities represent a profound cosmic mutation of the psychic vampire mythos. They are completely ancient solitary shapeshifters that operate entirely in the shadows of modern forensic science. The creature featured in The Outsider roots itself in the ancient dark folklore of Mexico and South America, specifically the myth of El Cuco, the monster that eats children. The plot of The Outsider begins with an impossible, completely baffling crime. In the small town of Flint City, Oklahoma, a beloved Little League baseball coach named Terry Maitland is arrested for the unspeakable, brutal murder and mutilation of an 11-year-old boy. The local detective, Ralph Anderson, has an airtight, seemingly flawless case. He has Terry's fingerprints all over the crime scene. He has matching DNA evidence, and he has multiple eyewitnesses who saw Terry covered in blood right near the location of the murder. But as the investigation deepens, an impossible paradox emerges. Terry Maitland has an equally airtight, completely flawless alibi. At the exact hour the murder took place, Terry was over 100 miles away in another city attending a literary conference. He is caught clearly on television cameras, his fingerprints are found on hotel glasses there, and he is seen talking to multiple reliable professionals. Terry Maitland was literally in two places at the exact same time. The narrative transforms from a standard police procedural into a terrifying supernatural investigation, when the characters cross paths with Holly Gibney, a beloved recurring character from King's Bill Hodges' trilogy. Holly is the one who realizes that they are not dealing with a human criminal, but with an ancient, biological parasite. The outsider is a creature that survives by stealing human identities. It targets a specific individual, makes physical contact to obtain a sample of their blood or skin via a simple scratch, and then enters a cocoon-like state for several weeks. During this time, its biology systematically replicates the target's DNA, allowing it to form a perfect physical clone of the victim. But why does it commit these horrific crimes? Does it need to drink human blood to survive? No. The outsider is a cosmic grief eater. It commits an unspeakable, highly localized tragedy, the murder of a child, solely because it feeds on the massive radiating shockwaves of intense human grief, despair, suffering, and anger that inevitably follow the event. The creature doesn't just destroy the child, it purposefully engineers the crime so that an innocent man like Terry Maitland will be blamed. It sits in the dark corners of the community, using its shifting glamour to blend into the crowds, literally drinking in the tears of the parents, the destruction of marriages, the suicides of relatives, and the complete social devastation of the town. The economic and emotional ruins of human lives are its literal meat and drink. It is a vampire that has evolved to weaponize our own empathy and legal systems against us. In 2020, The Outsider was adapted into an exceptional, critically acclaimed 10-episode miniseries by HBO, starring Ben Mendelsohn as Detective Ralph Anderson and Jason Bateman as Terry Maitland. The series is celebrated for its incredibly bleak, slow-burn, atmospheric cinematography and its gritty, realistic approach to the supernatural, treating the monster not as a cinematic caricature but as a heavy viral disease that corrupts the reality of an entire American town. Finally, in the 2020 novella If It Bleeds, Holly Gibney encounters another standalone member of this exact same parasitic, grief-eating species. This particular entity has chosen an even more efficient, terrifyingly modern hunting ground for its unique diet, the 24-hour cable news cycle. The monster poses as a charming, veteran television news reporter named Chet Ondowski. Holly happens to watch a live news broadcast covering a horrific, tragic suicide bombing at a local middle school. As she watches the footage, she notices something strange about the reporter on the scene. Chet Ondowski always happens to be the absolute first journalist on the scene at major mass casualties, building collapses, and horrific train wrecks across the country. Using her elite investigative skills, Holly digs deep into historical news archives stretching back over 80 years. She discovers that the exact same face, the exact same vocal cadences and physical mannerisms, has appeared in newsreels dating back to the 1940s, always reporting from the epicenter of America's most devastating public tragedies, under different names. Holly realizes that this creature has realized something brilliant about the modern world. It no longer needs to go through the difficult, messy process of committing crimes itself to feed on grief. Instead, it simply monitors police scanners and emergency frequencies, using the infrastructure of modern mass media to arrive at scenes of fresh, localized human tragedy. By standing in the middle of a disaster zone, surrounded by burning debris, crying families, and dying victims, it can sit down to a massive, invisible feast of pure human suffering, while being paid by a television network to broadcast that trauma directly into millions of living rooms across the world. It is the ultimate evolution of the Stephen King vampire, a monster that doesn't hide in a Gothic crypt, but stands directly in front of a television camera, looking right at us through the screen. When you step back and look at this entire massive landscape across 50 years of fiction, you see that Stephen King's relationship with the vampire is one of the most fascinating creative journeys in modern horror literature. He didn't abandon the archetype after he finished writing Salem's Lot in 1975. Instead, he realized that the classic Gothic tropes of Bram Stoker were just the first chapter in a much larger story about human vulnerability. King understood that what makes a vampire truly terrifying isn't the supernatural ability to turn into a bat or the fear of a wooden stake. It is the fundamental, terrifying concept of being prey. It is the realization that there are entities operating in the blind spots of our universe that look at our most sacred human qualities, our love for our children, our collective grief during a tragedy, our inner psychic talents, and our trust in our neighbors, and see them as nothing more than a rich hunting lure or a source of food. By taking these monsters out of the castles and placing them on our interstate highways, inside our suburban shopping malls, at our local airports, and on our evening news broadcasts, King achieved something extraordinary. He proved that the things trying to slowly drain our vitality, our faith, and our life force aren't always wearing velvet capes. Sometimes they are the very systems we live in, the people we cross paths with on the road, and the unexplainable horrors that live quietly right next door,